how do we sit with those things when, maybe there is no like perfect, shiny, like wrap it up in a bow ending? Or, how do we understand that where we are today is because of a hard thing that happened in the past? And, I think for me, it just means I approach these things with a lot of sensitivity, and I try not to come into it with like, here's the story I want to tell about you failing and then achieving victory. For me, I really want my guests to lead, and I want them to feel comfortable being vulnerable about like, if they honestly feel like they've, worked through whatever it is that they encountered, or if they, if they're still struggling with it in a real way, like that's legitimate. You can be successful and still struggle with stuff that happened in your past. And like, there's room for both of those things.
That is Zoë Rom, and this is the Well Mind Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back if you have been an active listener, and a warm welcome to those listening for the first time. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Coles. My guest in this episode is an athlete, journalist, an associate editor for Trail Runner magazine, and the host of DNF, a podcast focused on telling stories of failure in running and in life. In Zoe's podcast, she talks with a range of folks from everyday runners to some of the most successful elite trail runners in the world, and she visits with them all about the times they failed. She believes that the greatest stories and opportunities for growth come through failure. So we explore this topic and much more during our conversation. Zoe shares her desire to spotlight narratives that aren't typically front and center, so that she can support people in telling their stories to a wider audience. We dive into topics and themes related to mental health, anxiety, body image, and the environment. We also explore how to buffer ourselves against the negativity, fear, and criticism of the world and our own mind. There are just a couple of housekeeping items for today's show, two terms that I want all of my listeners to know because we don't really explain them while we're talking. The first is DNF, the name of Zoe's podcast. It stands for Did Not Finish. This is the designation a runner gets when they drop out of a race. The other one is FKT. That stands for Fastest Known Time. So when a runner sets a record time completing a well-known trail, like the Appalachian Trail or the John Muir Trail, they earn the designation FKT for that record, the fastest known time. Okay, that's it for housekeeping, so let's get to it. Here's Zoë Rom in episode 9 of The Well Mind. Embrace your failure. Thank you so much, Zoe, for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate you spending some time with me and talking about hopefully some things that you're pretty passionate about. I've really enjoyed listening to your your podcast, DNF. We can get a little bit into that and some of the other creative outlets that you have, but maybe it'd be good just for you to do a little kind of personal / professional introduction of yourself for our audience so that listeners can get to know you a little bit.
Yeah. My name is Zoë Rom. I am the associate editor at Trail Runner magazine and a coach at Microcosm Coaching. I'm also the host, producer, writer, sound engineer for the DNF podcast.
Awesome. Yeah. So one of the main kind of goals with the Well Mind podcast is to really talk with people about a broad range of ideas, themes, all related to our wellness. And I was first listening to you on kind of one of my personal favorite podcasts. It's just a trail and ultra running one where they were interviewing you. And I just thought it was such a novel approach that you have taken to kind of cultivating and unearthing people's stories. And rather than focusing on their successes and their victories, you've made an intentional decision to kind of work toward or elicit stories of people's failures. And so maybe that's kind of where I want to start today is how did you decide to do something like that, to pursue that angle in exploring people's experiences?
Yeah. So initially, I was actually doing some market research to see what other podcasts were out there. And I had initially been interested in doing a podcast about FKT's fastest known times. It took me all of 3 seconds to uncover that there already was a podcast about people who do fastest known times. So I started listening to an episode that had my friend Jeff on it. And he had attempted to do a fastest known time, I think in the White Mountains. He tried to do one naked, and he failed miserably, and had to like bail halfway through and had to like seek shelter unclothed in a remote cabin somewhere.
Oh
And I
my
just remember
goodness.
thinking like, oh my gosh, like the story of him totally bungling this FKT is way better than any
Mm-hmm.
than any victory story, right? And then I became really interested in how, not only in that specific instance, but in how generally stories of failure are just more exciting. Like I have a saying that I've adopted from somewhere else. Actually, it was a friend in high school had always told me like first dates, they're either a good time or a good story. And I feel like that is just true for all things in the universe. Like it's either really great or it'll make for a good story.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make a podcast that focused on the good stories rather than about people achieving greatness necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Not just because of, like, oh yeah, I love to reframe stories about success so that they focus more on failure, but also just like as a storyteller, failure is where all the narrative tension is. That's where all the excitement is. That's where like the fun stuff happens. That's where you end up naked and alone in the White Mountains.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you're a fantastic storyteller, and I certainly hope that after people listen to this podcast, that they take a moment and listen to yours for sure, because it's a unique way of presenting the material. You're kind of interspersing some narrative of your own, drawing on maybe history or literature, and then kind of tying that in and connecting it with people's stories, because there's certainly some of the most successful people that we know about that are commonplace names have tremendous amounts of failure in their background too. So you kind of being able to parallel those stories, I think that's pretty cool. So first of all, kudos to you. I'm just kind of paying you a compliment there.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah. But on the other hand, it seems like you're getting information, you're getting knowledge, you're getting experiences and insight that normally we don't ever get to hear. And that's the another part that I'm really interested in is kind of like, as you've been sitting with people, and now I know some of the names of the guests on your podcast because I'm kind of a trail and ultra geek. I just like that kind of stuff. And when I saw that you had like interviewed Jim Walmsley, like I was like, man, he's never on podcasts, but yet here he is kind of talking about his life experience. What is that like for you when you're kind of sitting with people and you're asking some kind of hard questions, asking them to be vulnerable? I guess I'm curious what that experience is like for you.
Yeah, I think primarily it speaks to the bravery of the guests I have, because it's not easy to like get on a podcast and talk about separating from the Air Force or a divorce or getting fired or stepping away from a job or losing a parent. And all of those are topics we've covered. And those are, I think something that's also interesting is seeing like in Jim Walmsley's podcast, like there's varying degrees of separation from these hard things. Like some people are like, oh yeah, I was fired. And like, now that I'm in the place I'm in now, it's totally fine. And I think there are other, like Jim is still like a little bit closer to the failure he experienced. And I think that, that is a part that for me, like is tough because I want to honor their stories in a way that feels good for them while still being honest with the audience that like, these are really hard things, and it's okay to go through a hard thing and not immediately feel like you have to turn it into a success or like find the cool, encouraging story. So I think it primarily speaks to how amazing my guests are. And I always just try to, in my approach, be really cognizant that I'm asking someone to be really vulnerable and that they may or may not have worked through whatever it is that we're talking about. Like in the podcast about Amelia Boone, the storyline was essentially that she still, is recovering from an eating disorder, and that it's an
Yeah.
ongoing process,
Yeah.
and that it's not, oh, I fully healed from this eating disorder and now I'm an amazing, strong person. It's, I have
Mhm.
not fully recovered from this thing, and I am still an amazing and strong person. So how do we sit with those things when, maybe there is no like perfect, shiny, like wrap it up in a bow ending? Or, how do we understand that where we are today is because of a hard thing that happened in the past? And, I think for me, it just means I approach these things with a lot of sensitivity, and I try not to come into it with like, here's the story I want to tell about you failing and then achieving victory. For me, it's, I really want my guests to lead, and I want them to feel comfortable being vulnerable about like, if they honestly feel like they've, worked through whatever it is that they encountered, or if they, if they're still struggling with it in a real way, like that's legitimate. You can be successful and still struggle with stuff that happened in your past. And like, there's room for both of those things.
Yeah. Yeah. And that feels so authentic, because I think when we only get part of the story, there's that sense there like, oh, there's something else going on here. There's, you know, I've talked to people about perseverance, about goal setting, about staying motivated, and there's this kind of shadow side to that. That there are plenty of times in life when we're not motivated, we're not. Maybe we don't even like the goal that we set for ourselves anymore, but yet here we are still kind of like trying to plug away at it or peck away at it. And so being able to really honor and respect both sides of this story is, I mean, I think we need more of that. And right, my background as a mental health counselor, I spend a lot of time with people talking about that. Like, how do you honor and respect your experiences, but not be singularly defined by them, either by a success or by a failure. But I like that term of making room for both of those things.
Right. Like, just because, every person, you're not just successful or just in the struggle. It's like you struggle and you find success, and then you're going to struggle more and again. But, like the more you can learn, maybe the easier the struggle gets, or the more capable you are at encountering it. And just like accepting whatever part of that process you're in now. Like anytime, like particularly with mental health issues, just telling someone like, it'll get better, you'll see the other side, that almost never makes it feel better. I think it's always better to approach people with like, what you're going through is hard. I see you. I'm holding your feelings. Like, we'll get through this together. And it's okay if
Hmm.
you don't feel that way right now.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, and that, I mean, that speaks to just being present with somebody in a real way. Also, you're not gonna say, well, buck up and or let's go for a run and you'll feel better. You might end up doing that, but that isn't the solution. That's just something that maybe comes out of you just being present with that person.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so, I mean, there's kind of two pieces that that you're talking about already today, and that's this idea of growth and like learning and becoming either stronger or more knowledgeable through our experiences. But then there's also this like deep acceptance of what the experience is. And that seems like a hard balance of like accepting it on the one hand, but then also saying, well, maybe this is a growth opportunity or a learning opportunity. Um, and I think, you kind of talked about the proximity to the event being one of the factors, but like with the eating disorder, and I've listened to some of Amelia Boone's other like narratives and podcasts, so I'm familiar with her story, and certainly familiar with the trajectory of eating disorders as well, that those aren't ever um, resolved to the point where it's like, "Oh, I don't even have to think about that or worry about it." Like the reality is that's going to be an enduring vulnerability potentially for life, right? So for you, I guess I wonder that there must be something for you that also gives you this ability to be compassionate with people. Like, so I'm kind of wondering what experiences you've had, Zoe, that have kind of primed you for doing some of this work, because this isn't typical. I mean, we've kind of established that it's not standard stuff. So as you kind of look back in your life, like what are some things that you point to as like growth moments or moments where you've been able to accept something or you're working at accepting it?
Yeah. So in college, I actually sought treatment for really challenging anxiety and depression. And, have been in therapy ever since, which it was very effective for me and would encourage other people, give it a try, understanding that there's lots of ways to approach healing for different,
Sure.
mental health challenges. But I mean, there was definitely a time where I felt like this is how I'm going to feel forever. And that was the hardest thing, was like feeling like there wasn't another side to it. And then after, seeking treatment and working through that and kind of, just doing the really unglamorous work of like showing up to a bunch of different appointments that I really didn't want to be at, and like having a bunch of conversations with people that I really didn't want to have, it, I realized that almost a lot of people that I look up to struggled with the same things, and a lot of my peers struggled with the same things. And the more I talked about it, the easier it got, and the better I was able to like, the first step for me was accepting it. The second step was, working through it. The third step was learning from it. And then now I feel like I'm able to like, personally find humor in my own, whenever my brain does funky stuff, I can find enough distance to find humor as one of my coping mechanisms, or find community and connection through it as well. And I feel like that just gave me, like, in learning to just view myself more empathetically, I was like, oh, cool. I want to do that to everyone. I want to like be able to connect with other people in the same way I'm pushing myself to kind of get curious about my own thoughts and feelings. And then also just like as a journalist, something I've always believed is that I want to care about a lot of things that have nothing to do with me, right? Like I don't want my own empathy to be the limiting factor on what stories I can tell. So, personally having never encountered like substance dependency, that was a story I really wanted to tell in a way that would resonate with other people. And so, I wanted to approach it from an angle where it's like, sure, I've had like my own mental health journey, but I want to be able to tell stories that like aren't like, I don't need to have a personal connection to tell a really amazing story. So like it's learning to like separate, like how does, my own experience, like in terms of navigating the choppy waters of owning and operating a human brain, how can I use that to my benefit, but also not let it like limit the stories I want to tell. Right. And I think just like trying to have empathy, like really radical empathy, where I'm both able to, depending on the situation, either say like, hey, I've gone through the same thing. I get it. I hear you. This is valid. Or say like, hey, I have no idea what it's like to go through this. Like, please walk me through it. Like, help me understand, help me communicate this in a better way to other people. And just kind of knowing like where, the limits of effective empathy are for myself, and not letting what I've experienced limit me in a way, but make it something that opens doors rather than closes off conversations. And sometimes that can be tough because like I love talking about myself and I've only ever experienced my own life. But one of the amazing things about being a storyteller and a writer is that I get to temporarily make a really concerted effort to get outside of myself and to really try to honestly see and understand things from someone else's perspective, and then do the work of translating that in a way that other people can understand and like actually try to feel that.
So much good stuff there, Zoe, that I want to try and break some of that down and talk about it, because you're right. So much of what we decide to do, whether that's personally or professionally, is probably born out of our personal experiences, or experiences that have been really close to us, because that's that's where passion comes from, right? It's that we do have an emotional connection to it. It's not just intellectually interesting, but we feel something about it. But then what you said too, not limiting yourself to this kind of scope or range that is only, a mirror image of your experience, even though it's somebody else, but it's like, yep, I can totally relate to that. And I get it. But by expanding that, you still are standing on this platform of like empathy and trying to be compassionate and understanding to people, but really opening it up to allow a broad range of ideas, topics, experiences to kind of get channeled then through you, through your storytelling or journalism, in a meaningful way for people that are going to consume that content.
Exactly. And I feel like, just to, piggyback off that, something that's been really important for me is to include a diverse range of voices on the podcast. For instance, having specifically Allison Desir come on and talk about mental health specifically in the Black community, because that's something that, while I, know a good bit about my own mental health, I didn't know anything about that. And I have not a lot of bandwidth to speak honestly and authentically to that experience. And so knowing, kind of meeting people to the point where I'm like, I'm a person, you're a person, we've been through hard things. However, the intersection of your identities make this hard thing exponentially harder. So like, how can I support you in telling your story and like leverage my privilege and expertise and empathy, to support you in like bringing your truth to a wider range of people? And, I did the same thing with the Verna Volker episode, which is about, it's about both female resilience and violence against women in the Native American community. And so, how do I leverage the fact that like, I'm hugely passionate about feminist issues, or I'm hugely passionate about mental health issues? How do I, once again, not let that limit me and like just talk about white lady feminism, or just talk about like white person mental health, warm fuzzy type things? Like, how do I leverage the things I'm passionate about to challenge myself and challenge the community that I'm entrenched in, to, use our knowledge and expertise and personal experience to meet other people with theirs.
Yeah. What makes that important to you? I mean, it really sounds like there's like some kind of core value that you're really speaking to, that's personal to you.
Yeah, I think it's previously something that I failed at in a really major way, right? Like I would get so passionate about like how I felt about feminism, or how I felt about mental health, or like how I felt about environmental issues, that I totally sidelined a huge variety of narratives that not only are important to talk about, but that I would have absolutely benefited from, right? Like, though I'm passionate about environmentalism, without environmental justice, that conversation is going to fall flat. Though I'm passionate about mental health, if my conversations about mental health don't spotlight our most vulnerable populations, then they're going to fall flat. I'm hugely passionate about, women participating in running, women's safety, women's advocacy. But if those conversations don't include the most vulnerable populations, or populations whose narratives aren't always front and center, then they're also going to fall flat. But whenever I can talk about like mental health in the Black community, that benefits everyone. Whenever I can talk about violence towards Indigenous women, that benefits everyone. When we can spotlight those narratives, not only does it's like a rising tide doesn't always lift all boats. Like if I only ever share my personal experience, other people are going to get sidelined. But when I bring other people's narratives front and center, I will benefit from the hard work that these people have been doing for a long, long time.
2020 has been such a challenge on so many different levels for people. And I was talking to a good friend of mine on the podcast. He's actually a pastor that works in inner city Milwaukee, and he was speaking about like how nobody is doing well in 2020, like everybody's struggling, but there are lots of people that are struggling more, that are disproportionately affected by these social justice issues, by the pandemic, current political divisiveness, right? All of these kind of factors have like culminated in really impacting certain communities in a very difficult way. I live in Minnesota. I'm in a more rural community, but I'm not that far from Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so kind of that ripple effect too has certainly been felt in all of the communities around here. So that desire to bring these voices out into a wider audience, and maybe thinking, how can I, this is a question that I've asked myself, and in part as I've embarked on this process of building a podcast too, is like, how can I have a positive impact on my community? And we can define community in lots of different ways. And so that's absolutely kind of one of the core kind of values or ideas that I've had at the forefront of starting this process. And so it sounds like that's a parallel for you too. right? Like
Yeah.
there's this value for making a positive, constructive impact in your community. So when you think about your community, like what are they? What are your communities, and kind of what are you hopeful for?
Yeah, I mean, man, I love this question. I've been thinking a lot recently. One of my favorite poets is Gary Snyder, and I was reading this essay he wrote back in the '70s about like the importance of bioregionalism. So, I think that helps me think about how I define communities more broadly, right? Like I also live in a very small rural community on the western slope of Colorado, a town of like 7,000 people. And like I'm hugely passionate about advocating for like, the environmental issues in my backyard, the lack of mental health resources in my backyard. So there's a way in which I think about like my little town of 7,000 people I hold very near and dear to my heart. I also think about my much larger community of trail runners. Like as the associate editor of Trail Runner magazine, we speak to a very broad range of people, that come from all different backgrounds. And I always want to kind of expand that community. Like I want to grow it, and I want to message in a way that makes more people feel included and also challenges the people that are already in the tent. I think if you're, if what you're reading and seeing doesn't occasionally make you feel a little bit itchy or like question things every so often, then you're not, you run, don't walk, basically. If you only ever read things that like reinforce what you already believe and hold dear, then you need to reconsider what you're consuming. And so I think in a way, I'm just trying to grow this community of trail runners and then challenge the community that's already here in the same way that I want to grow and be challenged myself. And, I think that like, going back to what I like quoting Gary Snyder, like the most radical thing you can do is stay home. I think about, not only like taking, like action on a local level to, raise awareness for the fact that like Colorado, high mountain Colorado actually has some of the like highest instances of suicides out of almost any other region in the US. Like Intermountain Colorado has like the highest insurance rates of anywhere in the US. So you have this like overlap of like a high density of mental health issues and a lack of resources for that. So like, how do I draw attention to that? And I try to be really intentional in our journalism about how we address things like that and like how we message around issues of mental health and how to care for yourselves and destigmatizing that. Like just this week, we ran a column from David Roche on about destigmatizing antidepressant medication, because that's something so many people struggle with. Like anyone who's ever gone through a really hard time with their mental health and has just been told to like do yoga or take a walk or like eat better, like that is some really harmful and toxic messaging. And so like, I'm trying to use the platform of trail running to send messages around like, hey, whatever you need to do to care for yourself is good. Take care of yourself. The world is better with you in it. And I just think like using this shared value of like, we all love running. Like that's the one thing, like if you're reading this magazine, that is the only thing I know about you. Everything else is just an assumption that I need to not make as a writer. And so starting at the point of we love running, can we destigmatize therapy? Can we destigmatize people who take medication to just be themselves on a daily basis? Can we destigmatize talking about these things? Can we destigmatize men owning up to having eating disorders and having challenging conversations around that? Can we talk about how that looks for women and how that's different for, how it looks for men, and just like use what we have in common to talk about the things that are kind of specifically hard for certain groups of people.
Absolutely. I saw on your Instagram feed today that you had like took a picture of an article from a running magazine talking about losing weight to increase performance. And I think it said, eat like a runner. And it was really like talking about limiting and restricting. And you said something to the effect of, this will never be a story in Trail Runner magazine as long as I'm one of the associate editors. Right.
Yeah. I try to, that's something that like some narratives that I am really not a fan of that you see a lot, particularly in the outdoor and fitness world, are either like profiles of people who lost a ton of weight and then did something awesome. I think that sends a really harmful message that you need to lose weight before becoming your true self and realizing your potential. You can reach your potential at the weight you're at, that is your potential. You do not need to change a single freaking thing about how you are to be an amazing runner or human or parent or partner or brother or sister, like human, like your potential is in the body that you're in if you treat it well and with kindness. And I think that's, you don't need to lose weight to get the race goal that you want. You don't need to lose weight to get like the personal or professional result that you want. And I don't like those stories that center on people who have to lose a ton of weight. I also don't love how-to articles that teach people how to restrict, because that can lead to a very slippery slope. And I will just say, anecdotally, as both a coach and an athlete, I've never seen someone's performance get better after losing weight. And I've seen a ton of people just absolutely wreck their careers by losing weight. I've seen way more people lose their career and lose touch with what they love and absolutely just like not be able to run. And I've never seen anyone's running like truly be meaningfully limited by what they currently weigh. And I think that we all benefit from just saying like, bodies look different. Like, sometimes I'm one of the bigger girls on the start line. That's awesome. I'm a mountain runner. Like, I want to have sturdy ankles. I want to be able to like roll down some screen. Like, I need to be a tough person. And there are also people who are going to be different sizes than me and be just as tough. And that's amazing. I just try to orient how I perceive of my body around the things I appreciate about it. And other people's bodies are different, but I hope that they find the same appreciation. And I'm just very, as someone who like, by some stroke of luck has some control over the media that gets out into the world, like I am never going to run I'm never going to run an article that's oriented around restriction. Thankfully, our nutrition columnist, she specializes in working with endurance athletes with eating disorders and has a all foods fit approach and offers a very balanced approach. And she always encourages athletes who struggle to not only work with a nutritionist, but also to seek out mental health resources as well, because it's a two-pronged thing, right?
For sure.
And if you're struggling with restriction, then like don't just reach out to a nutrition professional. Also like get curious about why you're feeling those things and how you can maybe flesh out your mental health toolbox as well. And I can't believe in the year 2020, almost 2021, that we're still seeing articles encouraging people to lose weight in order to be an athlete, because you can be an athlete at whatever freaking size you are right now.
Amen to that. And I appreciate that too, because like when people close their eyes and then create a mental image, and I say a female runner, like a visual is going to pop into somebody's head, or a male athlete, or something like a male sprinter or a male distance runner. Like there's an image that's going to come into people's head, and that is largely based on the media that they consume, right? So whether that's social media, whether that's articles, news magazines, all of these different pieces, like that's the template. Even though cognitively we might say, well, like I'm a runner and I'm oftentimes one of the bigger guys at the start line. Like that's okay. I don't have to be 160 pounds in order to feel good about being at the start line. And in the same respect, some of the guys that I know that are smaller, like they don't have to beef up. It's not about like making their body different than what it is. It's really about working with what we have and valuing it and appreciating it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because like it's all, what your body looks like if you're treating it well is just going to be like, humans are such an amazing species and we look all kinds of different, and that is awesome. And I think it's also goes to show that you can't know what someone's story is by looking at them.
For sure.
People that have struggles come in every size. And so one thing that always frustrates me as someone that operates Trail Runner Magazine social media is I've posted pictures of myself and gotten feedback both that I look too big to be a runner and that I look too small to be healthy, which just shows you that people don't know. People don't know stuff, and you can't take it to heart either way, right? And that it's inappropriate to ever make comments like that to a person that you don't know. The only time that it would ever be appropriate is that you have someone in your life who's struggling and you can ask them how you can help, I think. As not a professional in this realm.
Well, and I would support that. I think that there is a time and a place to be able to sit with somebody and say, I care about you, I love you, and I'm concerned. Either way, that is going to be a meaningful and compassionate way of approaching it. But dropping into the comments on social media or,
a stranger on the internet is
yeah,
like, you know, hey man, I appreciate you, but like, you don't know what's going on.
right, right. How do you buffer yourself with that, Zoe? Because you put yourself out there. There's a post from Instagram that I wanted to read today at some point that you had posted a while ago, but I'm curious about it. But it's just further evidence that you put yourself out there, and I think a genuine and authentic way. But then that opens you up to be vulnerable, right? So how do you buffer yourself with some of these pieces of being in the public eye?
Yeah, it is hard. Like I'm initially like, I did not get into journalism because I love attention. Like I got into radio because I enjoy being behind a microphone.
Mm-hmm.
But like, I mean, man, when I used to work in public radio, I always got unsolicited feedback about my voice, and it gets easier, but not a lot easier. And I think the big point, like what's been successful for me is just knowing that if I'm going to speak honestly and authentically from the heart, that makes me vulnerable. And that does open me up to criticism that maybe isn't helpful. So I think for me, it's always assessing, like, is this person genuinely meaning to give valuable criticism? A lot of times, no. And if the answer is no, you just have to disregard it. If the answer is like, yeah, maybe there's like a nugget of like something I can learn that's valuable from this person, and they are making a good faith attempt to have dialogue with me, then like maybe there's something to be said there. Honestly, like that's 1% of like what I get,
Sure,
honestly.
sure.
And then surround yourself with people that support you for who you are, right? Like whenever I post something very vulnerable or write something really vulnerable, I try to not read the comments, and I try to send it to people who I know love me and support me and
Mm-hmm.
see what they think. I think, something that I've done in the past is I've made a list of the people whose feedback I genuinely care about. And then I try to solicit feedback from them and use that. And like, not just yes men, like people who are going to say like, hey, you did a good job on this, but your argument didn't address this side of things. Or like, maybe there was a weakness here, or you could have said this better. And like, learning the difference between good, valuable criticism makes it so much easier to tune out randos on the internet who aren't genuinely trying to offer good feedback.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, like, I think I complain to my partner at least once a day about something that someone, like, as someone that moderates all the comments on our website and on our social media feeds, like, whew, there's a lot to wade through. But once again, just like kind of buttressing up myself with people whose criticism I value, because you don't have to value everyone's criticism the same, but you can't block out all criticism either.
Yeah.
Unless like if you're being vulnerable, like if you're opening up about something like about your experience, people cannot give you feedback on what your experience is. People can give me feedback on my reporting, but people can't tell me that the way that I sought out care for my mental health isn't valid, or that my feelings and experience aren't valid and valuable. Like those are some things that I'm not willing to accept comments on at this time, but there are other things that I am like always actively trying to solicit beneficial feedback on.
Feedback, yeah. And yeah, maybe that's a distinction just between feedback and criticism. There is kind of the intent behind it.
And that can be tough to suss out.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And a lot of that, what we're talking about is in an external sense. And I know, like for me, spending lots of years in the therapy room working with people, I don't know what the outcome is for a lot of folks, right? Because people come in and maybe they come in for 3 or 4 sessions. Maybe I meet with somebody for 3 or 4 months, maybe even longer than that. But at some point that relationship ends. Like I don't have one client that I've had my entire career, right? Like, so at some point that ends, and I don't really know what the outcome of that story is. But I have had folks that will take a moment and write a note or send a letter or verbally, through phone or in person, say something to me, positive or constructive about the time that we shared together. And those are the things for me that I really try and hold on to and file. Like that's something that I want to keep and that I want to come back to as saying the work is important, the work is impactful, and it's meaningful and it's helpful, because there could be lots of evidence that I focus on to the contrary. And that sometimes is like a perceived failure of myself, a perceived failure of the system, a perceived failure in the person trying to do the work, right? That those kind of stack up. And in that, if that's all I'm focused on, I'm probably not going to be in a very good headspace for the next person that I'm trying to work with, right? And I think
Yeah.
there's probably some parallel between that and what you're talking about too, because you're trying to be impactful, you're trying to do good work, but then there's these naysayers along the way that are going to be critical. And so, holding on to the good stuff and the victories, and then being able to be judicious about who you're listening to, what voices you're listening to in terms of feedback, so that you can continue to grow rather than the alternative of maybe like giving up, throwing in the towel, being defeated.
Yeah, exactly. I think, like you said it perfectly, like being judicious. Like, once again, you can't never get feedback, and you can't push away all the pushback that you get, because if you're doing good work, you're going to get pushback, and that's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, you can't make light without a little bit of heat. But you just can't, you do have to filter it. Otherwise, like, I never do my best work when I can like already anticipate the negative feedback I'm going to get. And I've been in that headspace so many times where I'm like, I want to like do something really cool and creative and ambitious, but I can already hear the mean people on the internet telling me that I'm like silly, or like that my voice is weird, things like that. And so I just have to insulate myself from the things that don't serve the end product, and then actively solicit feedback on the things where I know I can grow on.
Yeah, fear is one of the biggest barriers to our growth. And if we get consumed with that before we even get started, it's we're holding ourselves back.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then kind of flipping it, right? We're talking about external criticism, but so can I read something that you wrote? Is that okay with you? All
Go
right.
for it.
And this is on Instagram, so it's open access, but this is about the internal part of that, right? So we've been talking about external criticism, but there's also internal criticism. And you wrote, "To my inner critic, thank you for taking the time to read my work and reach out. That you would take the time to read something I wrote and respond means the world to me. But I have some feedback for you too. I'm so glad that you want perfection and recognition, because those desires can help me produce good work. But I'll never sacrifice weird, interesting work for the sake of perfection. And validation is a con designed to keep my work small, unoriginal, and predictable. It's not worth it. I know you're scared of failure. I am too. But my best work is done at the brink of my ability, where failure is likely and an essential part of the learning process. Look what scares you most in the eyes and run directly at it. It's hard to put yourself out there. People will disagree with you. People won't like you. Don't ever let that stop you from trying your hardest to get the weirdest little parts of your brain out in the world on paper and in podcasts. Sit with your deepest insecurities and understand them until you can translate them for the world. The part of you that feels like it's never good enough is exactly the reason you're already freaking great. Stay weird, work hard, be kind, Zoe."
I actually wrote that because I was having a really hard time with the specific person who was intentionally had like found me through Trail Runner and was like trying to engage with me on that platform. And when it became clear that he was just a troll, I blocked him, and he continued to like hunt me down on a variety of platforms. And that was really hard. Like, I had just never had that happen before. I'm not that public of a figure. I'm like, I'm an editor. I'm not like a famous athlete or anything. And so I think it was kind of one of my first real learning experiences of like, sometimes people are just struggling with stuff that you can't understand, and they're going to externalize it. And I felt like, so that is basically like, I have a template. I get so much feedback that I have a template email that I send to people who send just like bad feedback, where I'm just like, thank you so much for reaching out. The fact that you would even read what I wrote means a lot. So I just wanted to write something like how I would respond to, sometimes when I get that not well-intentioned feedback. I wanted to write something along those lines to the part of my brain that doesn't always give me helpful feedback too. Cause like, once again, it's like trying to find that thing in yourself where it's like, I'm always going to be my toughest critic. Like there's not a single mean thing a stranger on the internet can tell me that I haven't told myself 400 times.
Yeah.
And so like learning to push back against that voice in my own head where I'm like, when you're trying to write from that place of fear where you're trying to anticipate the bad feedback you're going to get, don't write from that place because it's not going to be good. Don't write from that place of like trying to shore yourself up against all potential criticism. Don't write from that place against like, well, you know, I've always done it this way, so I'm going to keep doing it this way just to not, you know, to not try something new or to not do something brave or to not be super personal and vulnerable. Anytime I write something incredibly vulnerable, the inevitable criticism is that you're just trying to get attention or like you're just hypersensitive. And so insulating myself against those parts of my brain that just echo those not so helpful thoughts. I think, you know, sometimes it's worth investigating, like, am I doing this to protect myself or is this valid criticism where I'm like, okay, maybe in being a little less emotive here, I can better tell this story or like I can be more effective, or learning to be like, no, that's actually just my brain trying to protect myself and like thank it, right? Like I'm glad that I have these protective impulses and that I have a filter, right? Like I'm trying to be thoughtful about the things I put out into the world and intentional. But I also don't want to let that thought and intention totally filter out everything that's authentic and vulnerable and like real about those experiences as well.
And so in that sense, you aren't focusing on the outcome. You aren't focusing on like, oh, it has to be this kind of a product, or I have to get this many likes or this many accolades, you know, in journalism or something like that. It's focused on the outcome. It's really driven from that internal process of like, what's important to me? Where are my values? Is this an authentic expression of myself? Is this an accurate or impactful representation of somebody else's experience? It's a much more thoughtful process that is about process than more about the outcome that you're going to get.
Yeah, exactly. It's focused purely on like where things are coming from with no attention to like, is this going to do well on the internet or not? Because anything that I make that I actually think is really great, like DNF does not, which is like a product of my like innermost being, doesn't do that great on the internet. Like out of almost any, like I could post a picture of myself running, just 4-word caption that's like mountains are great, and that's going to get a bunch of likes. And then I could post something that's incredibly vulnerable and the product of 60 plus hours of work. And you know what? It's just not going to get as many likes. And that is totally okay, because that is not the point.
That's not the point. Yeah. Yeah. It's not focused on the outcome, which I think, yeah, again, that's a recurrent theme for me that I end up visiting with people about, because we are so driven by the goal. Like, and we need to balance this, right? We need to be able to set goals, to have aspirations, to be working toward things, but also recognizing that we're going to stumble and we're going to fail along the way. But also trusting that if I can persevere through that, if I can accept that, if I can grow, that's going to get me that much closer to that end goal. And maybe I don't achieve it in the way that I want to, or maybe it doesn't look the way I thought it would. But to steal from you, I've got a whole lot of good stories along the way, right? And I've grown and developed myself as a person because I've been challenging myself.
Yeah. I feel like if your long-term goals don't have a lot of room for acute setbacks, then they're not big enough.
So how do you persevere? Where do you draw? What do you draw from to be able to, when you hit a roadblock, things don't go that well for you, then what? What are you turning to?
I think I am very inspired. Like one of the reasons that I wanted to make DNF was because I'm so inspired by knowing that like everyone that I look up to has been through some real hard stuff. And that's okay. And that they have been like being able to be like, okay, you know, this person didn't have their dream job and was not on what they felt like was a path towards success when they were my age. And now they're amazing. So like, you know, just because this is happening to me today isn't like the end of my story. And so like, leaning on the stories and experiences of others helps me draw on their experiences to, you know, allow myself to move forward. And then also just like reminding myself, you've been through hard stuff before and you're going to go through hard stuff again. The stuff's never going to get easier, but you're going to get a lot more capable. And then it's okay if you don't feel very capable in the moment. Like everyone struggles, everyone meets challenges they don't feel like they're ready for, and that I've survived everything up to this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nothing's beat you so far.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that, you know, I think like that's the hard, like when you first start to meet like real kind of life challenges for the first time and you don't have past experiences to draw on, that's what makes it so hard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when I first, you know, was struggling with like some mental health stuff, just because it was new was like why it was really hard. And now whenever, you know, I encounter intense anxiety or depression, I'm like, oh, I've seen this before. Like I know what's going on, and I've felt like I was never going to feel better before. And then I did. So just like having that hope and knowing that like you can work through it. There's another side. It's okay if it doesn't feel that way right now. Just like keep going. You know, just stay in it. Right. Like it's, I mean, as an ultra runner, there's the, you know, always this, you're always going to hit rough patches, and the people who are just curious about what's on the other side are the people that stay in it the longest, because the rough patches are inevitable.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I know, I mean, obviously I know that there's probably a small minority of my listeners that are ultra runners, but it is something that I'm passionate
Good decision.
about. Yeah. Yeah, probably. They can judge me for that. That's okay. But absolutely something that I have come into close contact with, both myself and then fellow runners, that as we're moving through the day, moving through the mountains or the hills or, you know, whatever, like there are some really rough spots. And sometimes it is just about like one foot in front of the next foot, in front of the next foot, to be able to keep moving. And sometimes you do need to pause, and maybe that's to eat a scrambled egg burrito or quesadilla or something like that. But you're still doing something in that moment that's going to serve you in being able to move forward by pausing and attending to your body. And I think there's just such a rich metaphor there for life as well. I don't know if you're familiar, hopefully probably, with Billy Yang. And I mean, I just love his stuff and adore the work that he does. He's got such a great perspective on things. But yeah, he has that kind of famous video, Life in a Day, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes I just go back and watch that because it really speaks to the power of perseverance and how perseverance kind of feeds back in on itself. And that just by continuing to move forward, we're going to gain more traction and confidence and competence to be able to face whatever's kind of down the trail or down the road in life.
Exactly. And I feel like, you know, in life and running, there's very little that just eating a quesadilla and moving forward can't make a little bit better.
Or cookies, right?
Yes.
I think you're a fellow lover of cookies.
I love cookies.
Yep, me too. Me too. So this is great. I'm wondering, Zoe, what kind of things are you reading right now for yourself? You're obviously a creator of a lot of content, and you're pretty thoughtful about that. So I'm guessing you're probably pretty thoughtful about the content then that you consume and take in. So I'm real curious. What are you listening to, reading, watching? What are some things?
Yeah, man, I can be sometimes like an obsessive consumer, and I have to make sure I like moderate and am protective of my mental space, just because like, I mean, last week with the election, I just spent so much time staring at the New York Times, like either the needles or the electoral map that like I could probably name off every county in Georgia at this point. And that's like not what I want to spend my one like wild and precious life doing. So something, you know, I've been reading lately actually is it's kind of a compendium of modern writing about the desert from Indigenous and Latinx perspectives. And I've been so my undergraduate degree is in eco-poetics, specifically on how we can use desert literature to connect readers to basically climate change, like how the desert being kind of a weird landscape has always been addressed, particularly in American literature, in a really specific way that according to my thesis, upends Adam Smith's theory of sympathy to create a new model for connection with both landscapes and other hyper objects like climate change. So I've always just been very into reading about deserts. I love deserts myself. And I've been reading that it's called The Nature of Desert Nature. And it's just a variety of essays from various voices that have been overlooked in American literature from one of the essays that really stood out to me was by Francisco Cantu, who is a Latino border guard agent, and just kind of like wrestling with the kind of contrasting elements of his identity and how that kind of plays out in borderlands literature, which is also very interesting to me. A podcast I just enjoy two podcasts that I love and I feel like inspire me a lot, neither of which is even remotely about sports, are Heavyweight by Jonathan Goldstein, which is a beautiful narrative podcast about reconciling with the past. Each episode focuses on a different person who has to have a tough conversation with someone who maybe like something went wrong in their past, or there was like a missed connection. And so it's all about reconciliation, but the writing is very unique and quirky. And it's like every episode makes me laugh and cry and like feel the entire spectrum of human emotion. And for me, like that is what really good work does, is it makes me feel everything within the space of an hour.
Yeah.
Another podcast I really like, which is now on hiatus, is The Anthropocene Reviewed, which is by John Green, who he writes basically essays where he reviews facets of the human-centered universe, which is really like he'll review chicken fingers, tic-tac-toe, global warming, air conditioning, sycamore trees, like just random things. And each review turns into an essay that just is really beautiful, and I think touches on a lot of things that I've either resonate really specifically or feel very new to me, and I enjoy both perspectives.
Yeah, they challenge you.
Yeah, like, oh, I've never thought about soccer that way. Like, I didn't realize it could be such a spiritual practice for some people. And just the way that there's like pretty minimal production. It's basically just him reading essays aloud. But his writing is so engaging that it works really well for the medium. And I've always enjoyed his writing. In terms of journalism, I really love Kathy Ackner. She writes for the New York Times, and she specializes in profiles, and she always writes really good profiles that go to a place you don't expect. Her most recent one was about Tom Hanks and what a nice guy he is. And the whole story is about having the pressure to write about, oh, Tom Hanks, he's such a nice guy. And like her wrestling with like, do I tell this, like, do I try to find like an unexpected story, or like how to, what kind of prejudices do we always bring into these articles when we're trying to write them? It's her writing always kind of reminds me of the Frank Sinatra Has a Cold style writing of profiles, where it's like, a good profile is really never just about the person. It's about all of us.
Yeah.
But has the person's name in the title.
Yeah. Because then people are going to go to that. They're like, oh, Tom Hanks. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that. No, that I love that, because again, just like you try and challenge yourself with the content that you're creating, I can also tell that you're challenging yourself with what you're consuming, and not kind of sticking to your lane, really living out the fact that, okay, I don't want to have an echo chamber in the content that I'm reading or listening to. I want things that are going to be emotionally impactful, but also thought-provoking and challenging for you. Yeah.
And I mean, I always try to read from a variety of sources with impeccable fact checking.
For sure. Yeah. So, another kind of question or curiosity that I have is, like personally and professionally, what kind of things, are you working on right now? What's kind of on the horizon for you that you're excited about?
Yeah. So, my graduate degree is in environmental journalism, so I'm hugely interested in climate communication and how we can use things like sports or outdoor recreation to tell better stories about the environment. So I'm working on concepting a podcast about how the boom and bust cycles of the historical mining industry can teach us how to have a more sustainable and equitable outdoor industry. Like looking at patterns of like how the silver mining industry kind of parallels the boom and bust cycles we see in the ski industry as an increasingly unstable climate affects our ski seasons. Looking at wildfires, looking at avalanche cycles, looking at rural economic development. Like, in the ultra running world, there's a lot of discussion around how ultra running saved Leadville. I think that if you talk to someone who is struggling to afford rent in Leadville, or if you talk to the Latinx population in Leadville, they would have a different take on what saving Leadville means. And I think that a lot of times historically, it's the outdoor industry, when we have talked about environmental action, it has sidelined stories from people who maybe aren't just white people. And like, instead of looking just at how like, oh yeah, global warming means skiing is going to get harder, and trying to be more curious about like what that means for immigrant labor, what that means for avalanche forecasters, what that means for people who live in the wildland urban interface, which increasingly are either elderly populations or minority populations. Like if you look at the campfire near Chico, California, the majority of people that died in that fire were elderly, because a lot of the people who are being pushed out kind of into the wildland urban interface or the WUI are people who can't afford to stay in town. So like looking at how housing inequity and housing discrimination impacts whose homes are damaged in forest fires, and like how forest fire damage impacts climbing areas, and kind of just trying to tell a larger story about like, what's happening to the earth right now doesn't just affect where and how we play. It affects absolutely everything. And it has, there's like kind of the golden rule of climate is that the people who cause the least amount of climate change are going to be the most affected by it. And kind of looking at that through the lens of the outdoor sports industry, and historical mining, and how there's just like kind of cycles. And maybe if we lean a little bit harder on lessons learned in the past from like how, silver mining or, mining in Leadville, how we can just have a more sustainable and equitable outdoor economy that works for all people and the planet.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, and it's drawing on failings, really. I mean, times that as a society, we've failed. We haven't been either responsible, or we haven't had the foresight and planning. And that's resulted in a lot of hardship for a very widespread population of people. And so you're doing both again, right? You're both you're drawing out the failings and trying to grow and like accept those. That's the reality. That's what's happened. We are reenacting some of those things now, and so we need to learn from that so that we can grow from those failings, and rather than just continue in that cycle.
Exactly.
And then the other part, of course, is storytelling, right? Trying to tell the whole story, not just the glamorous part, but understand that there's multiple perspective, multiple experiences, and everybody honoring everybody's voice in that process.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's cool. Zoë, it has been so much fun talking to you today.
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed this time. The hour has just flown by for me. And so just really deeply grateful for you sharing your time and your thoughts and wisdom.
So great to talk to you, Ben. I really enjoyed this. Thanks for holding space and making time for a really fun conversation for me.
Yeah, awesome. All right. I'm so grateful to Zoë for being on The Well Mind, and I'm grateful to each of you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe through your podcast app so that you automatically get the latest episode. New episodes are released every Monday. Also, consider taking a moment to review the show if you found our discussion meaningful to you. Good old word of mouth is great too. Let people know about The Well Mind and spread the word. If you want to check out DNF, Trail Runner Magazine, Zoe's latest journalism projects, or the media that we made reference to in the show, Please check out the links in the show notes. Many thanks to the staff here in the Bethany Lutheran College podcast studio. Greg, Seth, and Caleb are tremendous in providing technical and editing support for the podcast. Special thanks to Lauren McMacken for designing the logo and cover art. All right, next week, I welcome registered dietitian and nutrition educator Lizzie Kasperick to the WellMind community. In our conversation, we take a look at all things health and nutrition, including covering some big myths about weight loss and dieting, exploring the emotional and cultural facets of food, and how our knowledge about food and nutrition is often incomplete. Lizzie works primarily with athletes at all levels and ages, and she drops plenty of truths during our chat that we can all learn from. Until next time, be well.